Welcome to the Octopod. I'm Kyle Davies, head of the Office of the CTO. Join us as we dive into the latest technologies and trends shaping business. Whether you're a tech enthusiast, a business leader, or just looking to stay ahead in the digital age, this podcast is for you. Let's unlock opportunities with technology together. Let's jump in. Welcome everybody to the third episode of the Octopod podcast. Now today I'm joined by Rob Sims, Chief Technologist for Hybrid Platforms, and Stephen Faulkner, Chief Technologist for Security in the Office of the CTO at CDW. Now, today we're going to be talking about how do we secure the hybrid world. So in episode 1 we talked about what is a hybrid platform, is it a mirage or is it actually possible and do people need it? We then went into episode 2 talking about how do we basically provide a hybrid capable workforce, whether you need it or not, because there's a load of things there around how organizations want to drive culture in their businesses. So today we're going to dive deep into how do we secure that hybrid world. And it's easier said than done in some cases, right? So the key takeaways you're going to get from this session are what's the importance of strategy, the challenges that you can see and try and overcome, the importance of tooling and approaches, and the skills that people might need to be able to execute on securing the hybrid world. And then we'll touch a little bit on technology advancements to support that and approaches you might want to take. So first off then, Stephen, we'll come to you. What are the challenges of securing this hybrid world from a platforms and a workforce perspective?
Sure. Well, there are many challenges, right? So if we take a step back, first of all, when you think about how we used to work, and how we used to turn up at the office, and how we used to build the walls of defence behind there, and everybody used to sit inside an office in a sort of protective shield, if you like. But as technology in the world and business started to change, and we become more mobile, more agile around where we need to be, where we want to work from, with the acceleration of cloud adoption, whether that be in SaaS-based cloud applications, or the forced move from working at home from pandemic and things like that, it caused a bit of an effect of expanding what we call the attack surface, right? So what you saw is more things you need to protect, more things you need to do detection and analysis on to figure out whether anyone's doing something bad, so attackers, etc. So there are many challenges. Some of the challenges come from compliance and regulatory, i.e. what you have to do. And some of those challenges are born from the fact that you've got a threat landscape out there that you're always facing, and you're making it easier for them in some respects by shutting down those perimeters, and all of a sudden all your stuff's out there. So it is massively challenging to try and secure that, and that ever expanding what we call the attack surface. It's a very challenging environment.
Yes, I think in summary on that, really what we're seeing is this expansion of the attack surface. So whether you're running on premises, whether you're in a public hyperscaler cloud, whether you're using legacy applications, SaaS-based applications and the modern application architectures, whether you're allowing people to be in an office or remote or from anywhere, anytime, any device, what kind of bring your own device models or not you might have, and all these kind of options that an organization has to provide choice and flexibility to the platform and the people, ultimately provides a challenge around risk and observability and being able to see what's taking place. And Rob, I don't know if you've got anything to add on the challenges there.
Yeah, certainly I think fully agree with everything that's been said, but I think the other challenge we're seeing is that sort of rapid adoption of changing work styles that was forced throughout the pandemic, and how that then has left a lot of organizations with disparate solutions, disparate technologies that aren't necessarily part of a fully defined strategy, as it were. So it's what was organically grown through demand and changes in the industry, changes in threat landscapes. And now we've got this. Well, some people are working from home and they're working in method A. We've got people working in the office. They're still working in the old method when they come to the office. And actually, we haven't re-architected that entire sort of network and data center fabric to support this modern way of working and simplified operations that come with it. It's still a mismatch of, well, when we're in the office, we work this way. And when we're in Starbucks, we work that way. And when we're at home, we work a different way. And therefore, to Stephen's point, we have gaps in the technology, we have gaps in the attack surface, and I think that's a lot of the challenges. We've been pushed into this organic level of complexity that really isn't helping people from an operational standpoint.
I think just to add to what Rob said, and also what you said as well, Kyle, because I think what we're also should be thinking about here is complexity, right? So the complexity of trying to modernise not only the workforce and the way they operate and the way they work and what they're consuming and how they're consuming it, but what you have in a legacy, you mentioned legacy, it's also trying to transform those applications, those workloads and moving stuff. The transformation element is another part of the attack surface that's always moving and changing. So you might apply different levels of controls or technologies around certain vulnerabilities that you might have on a legacy application or technology example. That might be totally different and needs to be enabled differently from a different technological perspective or even strategic perspective from policy or your overall security strategy. So that's another thing that makes everything a little bit more complex and challenging. So complexity is a challenge in itself.
No, I fully agree. I think all that complexity drives one core thing, which is a lack of visibility. What assets do we have? What data do we have? What applications do we have? What users, networks, technology? That level of visibility doesn't exist in a lot of organizations to be able to then make them truly informed decisions. So, and that's where I think a lot of the gaps then can appear. I wasn't aware that such and such had access to such and such, and therefore it's that unexpected outcome and breach that then catches you out and outside of it. So for me, visibility is one of the biggest challenges with any of these conversations, especially in a platforms world, because a lot of organizations don't know the full application catalog. They don't know the full data scope. They don't necessarily know every environment, every device they've got. Even the basics of where is every switch, where is every server, where is every VM. If you don't know that, you can't secure it in any way, shape, or form.
And I think the interesting thing there, just to pick on what you just both said there, was understanding what data you've got, right, and where that data is located and who's got access to it and things like that. And I think we've all gone through GDPR, right, in Europe, and we've got various other compliance and regulatory things we need to go through that are very similar from a data protection and privacy perspective. And it's crazy, really, to think about that organizations still don't have a grip on a lot of this when it's actually regulatory. And if you don't do it and you do get breached and you don't follow a right process, that you could potentially get fined significant sums of money for doing something you should have done that was actually launched many years ago now. There's a bit there that's quite interesting. And I think the other thing that was really just to pull out from what Rob was saying was the challenge and the complexity, not just of the platforms and the people for a second, but the evolving supply chain that an organization has and the third parties they work with and how that increases third-party risk at that point, right? And I think that's an area that a lot of organizations take for granted. And one of the things I remember speaking to a CISO about recently was, well, when you're doing your procurement, right, from a bid and a tendering perspective or whatever it might be, do you ask the question, how many vulnerabilities has that software vendor or platform had that you're potentially procuring in the last 12, 18, 24 months? And then you could sit there and say, well, I've got two proposals on the table, right, as an example. They're both roughly the same price. They both say they can meet the requirements, but one's had like 1,000 vulnerabilities and one's had 4. Or that one with 1,000 vulnerabilities is maybe, I don't know, 10% cheaper, but it's providing a significant amount more risk than the other platform is based on the history. So I think there's things there in like the process side of organizations we can put in to protect our business before we even get to the technology side of it. But we'll dive into kind of those kind of strategies and things now, I think. So I think if you think about the challenges we just discussed there, Stephen, if they were just worth thinking about what are the fundamentals of securing your hybrid platform and workforce? I'm going to dive in a moment into some of the specifics, but just at a super high level, what are some of the fundamentals that someone could look to implement?
Well, first of all, I think you mentioned strategy first. So obviously having a good core strategy around security is fundamental to everything that you drive. Thinking about how we develop policy around those security. So all of those things almost come first before you're thinking about applying your technology and how you should apply it. So that's key to starting any kind of security journey. Although nowadays we're also talking about secure by design, i.e. building security in up front with everything you do, rather than thinking about it as an afterthought and plugging something on top. It is part of your whole business continuity or business strategy. You mentioned there procurement and buying something that might have a particular vulnerability. Actually, if you had a policy in place that you did a security review on everything that you bought and brought into the organisation, you know that one that was maybe 10% cheaper wouldn't get procured because you have a policy in place that actually prevents you from bringing that level of security risk into the business, rather than you've bought it and then you figured out that you've got vulnerabilities, or you've been breached through the vulnerability, or you're having to pay more money to secure it. So the fundamentals really is about having a strategy. There are common frameworks that you can use that you can measure yourself against. NIST is very popular, more maybe stateside, and ISO 27001 is good to base your security from. Some, in my experience with some customers, they're either religious about it, i.e. building maturity against the framework, which I have some debates against, but actually following that gives them a guidance at least of what they should be looking at and how they should look at it and how to prioritize your security. So fundamentally, we need to be looking at data, right? So the data that you've got within the organization is fundamental to any business. Of course, that is what normally gets stolen or exploited or exfiltrated from an organization. So data is a key part of it. So it's a central part of your strategy, really.
So I think, and we'll come to Rob in a moment on some of the challenges that you see from a platform perspective, but I'll just kind of summarize some of that there that I heard. So I think the first thing really is that a strategy is not a list of tools, right? And it's very common that we see this in the channel, right? And as a service provider and value-added reseller and systems integrator, whatever you want to call a partner nowadays, and you go into an organization, you talk about strategy and go, yes, we've got a strategy and we're going to be putting all these tools in to provide these level of controls. And it's like, well, that's great, but what's the actual strategy? What are you protecting? How is that actually going to flow through to the people that need to enact and do something with it and things? And I think that's where that people and process and tooling things becomes very powerful in an organization. I think there's an element around how much time do you spend doing risk management versus quality management? Right, so how do we look at collating all the risks, prioritizing the risks, understanding what we can do to mitigate those risks versus finding the root cause and then quality managing those risks out of the business from the very beginning, like the procurement one I gave an example of at the very beginning. And fundamentally, really, if we ignore technology for a minute, which is crazy to think about on a podcast where we talk about technology, why don't we look at securing the processes that exist in an organization first, making sure it's well understood and how the data flows and how the people consume and use and integrate and all those kind of things, and then overlay the tooling that are available, because there's lots of tooling out there. There's thousands and thousands of products and services you can consume, but you can then choose the right ones that fill the gap that you need as an organization to make you fundamentally more secure than you would be if you spent millions and millions and millions of pounds on the next new tool, as an example. And to the point of frameworks, whether that's NIST, whether that's CIS, whether that's whatever framework you choose best. To your point, they are a blueprint. They are something you can follow to get a baseline and a bit of a jump ahead of how you could go ahead and put these control measures in place. And I know that from a CW perspective, we looked at a few of the frameworks and thought, well, how can we enhance these? And this was before NIST released the new version with the governance elements and a few other things. So I remember me, Rob, and a few other people in the past have gone through, and we created our own framework called the Cyber Resilience Framework, which was based on a visualize, withstand, and survive methodology, which then had even more layers below it and everything else, right? And how you would do that to go from processes and people all the way through how do you then recover in the case that you've had a breach or a significant failure. And then we mapped that to what I deemed as a minimum viable security capability, which is all of the capabilities we think every organization, irrespective of size, needs to be able to provide in their business. So that is everything from onboarding employees and doing identity checks and all that stuff, all the way through to having the platforms in place to get visibility from a managed tech response perspective, an EDR perspective, and everything else. So Rob, anything you want to add on like the fundamentals to securing your hybrid platform, or anything on the visualize, withstand, survive framework?
Yes, actually. But the overall piece there, yeah, having a framework, picking how you're going to follow it, I think it's the same as when you look at things like ITIL processes, etc. They're great guiding principles, but if you get too rigid with them, you can lose sight of what the actual objective of that framework was in the first place. So it's definitely a valid piece of advice there. We really do need to look at that sort of that withstand and survive part of the conversation, because the threat vectors are changing. The actors are doing different things now, and actually, a lot of times they're not bothered about encrypting your environment anymore. So, because they know you've potentially got a great recovery solution. If they've got in your environment and they realize they can't get access to your backup solution because you've isolated it on a separate network with a separate set of credentials and a separate identity provider and all of the great stuff that we know not every customer has managed to do yet, but some have. If you are that customer that sorted out that side of it, the threat actor is going to know that as they're sniffing around your environment, and they're not going to bother with the encryption. They're going to go with the exfiltrate and extort route, at which point your backup solution is not much use to you. What would have been useful is, to your point earlier, Kyle, is having less vulnerabilities in your estate, being able to track and know what data you've got on what system. So when you know that it was server X that was compromised, that had data Y on it, and therefore that wasn't PII, therefore it's not a major problem, versus, how many breaches do we see where people say, we don't know what was stolen? And that comes back to our conversation earlier around visibility. If we don't know what assets we have, we don't know what data we have and where it is, we can't respond appropriately to the threat. When that actor says, I've stolen all your data, you go, hey, what, you stole it off server 67? Yeah, I don't care. That was some rambling notes that I wrote about future strategy that I couldn't care two hoots about. So you can go do one as far as paying ransom, etc. So yeah, I think the basics, the fundamentals, vulnerability management, update management, network segmentation, all these things that we've been talking about for the last 10 years that still aren't pervasive through every company are the ones that people really need to think about and think hard about.
I think you're right, Rob. So often we say this, it's about getting some of those basics right. And Kyle already mentioned that the fundamentals, I probably should have mentioned it myself, technology, people, processes, right? But it is funny how some companies are always looking ahead to technology to solve a problem when actually they're not looking at the fundamental basics and getting the basics right of vulnerability, managing vulnerabilities well, looking at where their data is and things like that. So it is very important to get the basics right before you're even thinking about what technology you use to enhance and help you support that.
Yeah, and I think just to pick up on the story of basics that you both started to talk about there, what happened, do you think, when everyone looked at cloud or hyperscaler cloud technologies, right? What happened was people started to obtain access to things like network segmentation and various other approaches that they were struggling to implement on their on-premises platforms because of the way they'd architected it in the past and the legacy and technical debt they've accrued over the years. And when they initially moved to public cloud, in some cases, they managed to get this new capability. But that then created inconsistencies across what was a new world and a previous world, which then meant securing it was even more complicated. So I think maybe we can dive into, and maybe we start with Rob on this one, then we'll come to you, Stephen, as an overlay, is around what are the measures in place from a platform perspective around securing data across an on-prem and a cloud environment? What should people be looking to do in that case?
Once they get past the visibility piece, Kyle, then I think realistically it's about that segmentation piece. It's about controlling access to that data. And fundamentally, the network layer is probably the best place to do that, but also possibly the hardest place to do it as well. And that again comes back to a lot of times that these systems were built without proper documentation, without proper flows and processes in place, etc. So when you start to do that cloud transformation piece, one of the biggest things that tends to hold them projects up isn't actually the ability to technically move a workload from A to B. It's then that people want to deploy these new segmented networks in the cloud, but finding out the process flows, the data flows, etc., and then actually all the regression testing that's needed is what then tends to slow down most of these cloud transformation projects. One or two things happens, and either the project slows down and therefore they don't get the value, or someone starts to break the security principles because they have to get out of a data center, or they promise the board that they're going to do X and Y migration, and then they go, don't worry, we'll reapply the security profiles later. Don't worry, we'll get around to it. And then of course they don't, and then they get breached. And even when I've been deep in a lot of cloud migration projects, and you get halfway through and people are screaming about performance issues and this, that, and the other. And then you find that, oh, we forgot that this application connects to this data source over here, and that data source didn't get moved, and it's still on-prem, and then you've got latency issues or firewall issues. But it all stems back to that visibility piece. I think the important part here is if you don't think you can implement them measures on-prem, why are you going to be able to implement them in the cloud? Yeah, it's the same thing. We're setting up rules, source destination IPs on ports or services or tags or whatever it happens to be. The outcome is the same. You need to have the understanding of your application architecture. But I think once we get that, and most organizations can get there with the right amount of sort of dedicated input and thought and process around it, is actually how we orchestrate that then. So rather than building a network policy based on a rule, to your point, Cal, any, or source IP, destination IP, we should be building rules based on tags. We should be building automation into our network policies so that actually the policy is we shouldn't allow system A to talk to system B, and that orchestration then can be pushed to our data center networking run by, say, Cisco, for example. It can be pushed to our NSGs in Azure and pushed out to our policies in Zscaler, for example, that's doing our SSE solution. And actually then the policy is consistent across the environment through a central orchestration and management layer. And that, I think, is the nirvana state that people need to start working towards. But it's not going to happen overnight. Same as your point, Kyle, about procurement of applications and platforms that have got less vulnerabilities. It's not going to fix the problem today. So we still need to do our defense in depth that Stephen will talk about all day long about all the different things we need to do in different layers to protect our business. But we can't just keep adding more and more threats in and expect us to be able to beat the race over the next 5 or 10 years. So we have to have that long-term view of how we reduce vulnerabilities out of these, say, not just by patching them, but by buying better technology. And then, you know what? If we all stop buying vendor A because they've got lots of bad vulnerabilities, what are they going to do? They're going to start building better software because they can't sell it to their customers. So we can drive that behavior over time by our procurement methods at the end of the day as well.
And I think if you take a different approach to it, right? So people can be sat there listening to this episode going, oh, awesome, right? So we basically need to get our strategy in place. Great. We've got one already. We need to get network segmentation in place, but we've been doing that for years, and we can look at getting that sorted and getting consistency across our platforms where possible to do so. Then we look at the next kind of thing that everyone goes, well, in the event that someone does manage to get somewhere at that point and do something, they're using endpoint detection and response tooling to protect those workloads as well. So we can dive into how is that working in that hybrid world, and do organizations get the value from them today? So Stephen, do you want to kind of start with that one for us?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we're talking about EDR here, right? Endpoint detection and response. And I think if you fundamentally think about how it was developed and why it was developed, if we just take a step back, we've talked about monitoring visibility. When we actually saw something from a security analyst point of view, if you like, so we saw something bad happening, the MO of a security operations center, whether that was your own one built into your customer who's built your own SOC, or whether that was a source of security operation, what was happening is the response to an incident or something that you might have seen that was a threat used to be maybe at best a report going to a resolver group to say, we need to do something about this. The challenge with that was that many of those resolver groups, some of them maybe 9 to 5 and things like that, when they came in, actually they found it was too late and they were actually breached. So the development of EDR was a development first and foremost in technology that allowed not only your SOC to connect to that capability, have maybe possibly forensic capability to do deeper analysis and inspection, but also the capability of doing a response-based action, i.e. contain the threat or what it's detected. Whereas an old antivirus, sometimes if it saw something from a known threat on an environment, it may quarantine a file, right? So that's as far as it went. Whereas actually the threats and the types of attacks are a little more sophisticated. Therefore, an EDR can do a detection response and contain a threat better. But I'd say if you look at the market in that space right now, there's levels of efficacy. So they don't always get 100%. No one's saying that they can do 100% detection response.
Awesome. And I think when I look at it from an EDR perspective, I see it as part of a wider capability. So it's just one part of the puzzle. And that is, if you can use the same EDR platform across your platforms as well as your endpoints that your end users use, you get that single visibility and control mechanism that allows you to respond in the right way as and when something takes place. And I just want to quickly cover, before we go on to the next question, around the minimum viable security capability. Now, bear in mind, I am not a security expert, right, in any way, shape or form, but my kind of view on this was, I'll go away and I'll read the various frameworks that are available and pull the drafts out from NIST 2 when they were writing that. And I kind of, with my non-security mind, came up with some ideas. And I want to share just a few of those because I think it will really give the audience something they can take away and go, well, actually, we don't have that. Or we never thought about it this way. So we kind of looked at it from the NIST 2 perspective as a framework. So, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, and govern. And then we had that against our visualize, withstand, survive framework. So if anyone wants to see that, please reach out and we'll happy share the slide with you that has it on. But think about the identify area, we had things like asset management. And people are like, why is asset management on there for a security requirement? Well, it gives you a view of what you need to protect and what you need to get visibility of, right, as a starting point. The amount of organizations that have poor asset management solutions out there is unbelievable. So if you don't know what you've got, you don't know what to protect and secure yourself from. It's crazy. We look at the criticality of those assets, right, to your business. And if you wanted to look at a minimum viable company thing that I know that Rob's talked about in the past, which things can I go and attack to take down that company, right? And then what do I then need as a business to make sure it runs to allow my company to do whatever it does, whether that's making cakes or burgers, fries, whatever it might be. And you can tell I'm quite hungry at this moment in time. The other things in Identify is understanding the visible data repositories and data flows, looking at the service provider inventory that you work with in the supply chain, looking at your cyber threat intelligence feeds and how they're coming into your environment to get the latest information. Whether your ITIL capability and your change processes that you're using are working and people are adhering to them. Because if you're making unsanctioned changes, you're bringing in potentially unsanctioned risk as it comes into the business. Through to then the usual kind of in the identify phase, that kind of penetration and attack simulation stuff that allows an organization to get a bit of a view of how vulnerable they might be at certain levels of their environment. And then finally in the identify was having that external risk assessment done around the attack surface management, digital risk protection services, supply chain defense reviews, right? So in that identify bit alone, it's quite a lot there. What it gives you, to Rob's and your point earlier, is visibility to start making informed decisions. If we then move over into the protect one, how do we do identity, authentication, access management properly? So it's automated, ideally. How do we make sure that everywhere has MFA where required and has account segregation, so admins aren't logging onto normal devices with admin accounts and all that kind of thing? How do we make sure that the HR department have embedded identity checks through the platform as well? So we're always checking someone's real identity. We've got physical securities like CCTV, but it's got AI enhancements on it, ideally. So you can start to see that is a person, that is a TV, that is a whatever. So you know when someone's walking out with something of high value, potentially. The awareness and training that needs to take place. The kind of data lifecycle management, when we start getting into those things. The data at rest and transit encryption. The data exfiltration controls we want to put into an organization. The data classification, the backup, the patch management. Looking at your end of sale, end of life. It's massive, right? And that protection.
I think it might be playing, Kyle.
I don't know, it's like I've been, listening to you and a few others over the past few years, right? But then we start to really go into things like understanding that zero trust architecture and how you can conform to it in that protect layer. And then we can start looking at putting in secure access, web application firewalls, next generation firewall capability, because they're the boundaries, they're your moats kind of thing right around your crown jewels in some cases. And we still need those things. So we move from protect, we've got identify, we've got a bit of protect, there's a load of stuff there that I kind of reeled off. In detect, we then start to get a bit deeper into the visibility and monitoring piece, like infrastructure monitoring, third-party activity monitoring. So when you've got a third-party agency monitoring your conveyor belts, for argument's sake, in a manufacturing facility, you know what they're doing, right? You can look at protecting email, file, and collaboration services. So you know what's being transferred in and out of your business, potentially. And then identity monitoring, so you know that Kyle logging in from the UK is a good thing. Kyle logging in from somewhere in the Far East maybe isn't, because that probably isn't Kyle if it was trying to log in 2 minutes after he tried to log in from the UK, because I can't travel faster than the speed of light, obviously. And then there's things like the ITSM integrations for detection, so you can log the tickets for people to work against. How do you do SIEM and event correlation properly? How do we get the EDR and network detect response to the NDR a bit working nicely together, and maybe pumping that into an XDR platform? So lots of DRs going on here at this point in time, that then feeds that really holistic view across an organization. So at that point, we've done identify, we've protected, we're starting to detect things in a meaningful way, and then we need to respond if something bad does happen, right? So do you have incident response plans and playbooks in place? Right? A lot of organizations go, yes, I have. How many have you got? 2. Well, I can tell you now, 2 playbooks is not enough. Right? If you have a ransomware playbook for your UK entity and you've got an entity in Germany, you need one in Germany. right? Because the way that you respond in another region is very different in some cases, and the reporting lines you have to be compliant are very different as well. You then need to think about your incident analysis, how you're going to do incident response execution and control, so recording and integrity pieces. How do we then look at that SOAR capability to automate that orchestrating automation of a response, which I know, Stephen, you're very passionate about, so we'll touch on that in a moment. And then we'll go to MDR, EDR, NDR again, and XDR in respond, because it starts to bring that well together. So we've done identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, backups, obviously, right? But getting them done in the right way with clean rooms and all that kind of stuff is a really interesting thing to look at. How do we do cyber insurance? Do you need it? Right? I sit there and go, well, if you're not doing all the other stuff I just mentioned, don't bother with your cyber insurance policy, because you're probably not going to meet the minimum criteria to get paid out anyway. So there's little things like that when we secure this hybrid world. All these things sound really complicated, but they're actually not, and can be delivered by a power of a platform, one or two or three providers in a lot of cases. And then if we go to govern, that's all of the things that everyone hates, the boring stuff, right? So is things documented? Have you got your security charter and policies in place? Do you have tabletop exercises you've run with your stakeholders so they know how to react when something goes wrong? So you don't have someone go, well, do I speak to the legal team first? Do I speak to the CEO first? Do I speak to this person first? Because we had an example, I know, Rob, you gave this example at our Red Bull event earlier this year, that an organisation spoke to the threat actor once they've been breached, and they basically acknowledged they've been breached. When they then found their insurance company, they went, you're not covered because you spoke to them before us. Right?
100%, yeah.
So there's little things like this that people need to think about to really make a change. And then, again, having maybe critical friend activity with VCSOs if you don't have a CISO yourself that's as experienced. So there's a lot there that I've covered off in the space of, I don't know, maybe 5-ish minutes. But they're the kind of things that we need to be thinking about when securing the hybrid world, in my personal non-security view, as a minimum. So, Stephen, I think you had something you wanted to add there.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on incident response first of all, about those plans that you were talking about, because it just triggered in my mind that when you see business say, yeah, we've actually got that, we've got that in place, we've got our processes well documented, another key fundamental of that is how often do you test them, right? Because it's all very well writing everything down and saying, well, this is our procedure, we phone the CEO, we do this, we have a drains up and an exec drains up, or whatever the process is, or we phone our insurance first before we speak to the attacker's help desk. And they do have them, by the way. But yes, it's fundamental that you actually test that process of, let's pretend we've triggered off a major incident, let's see how everybody responds. You have to test your processes from time to time. I remember it was always a very difficult thing back in the disaster recovery days, when you're trying to test disaster recovery in a real world scenario in a bank, for example. It's a very difficult thing to do, from move production into a DR scenario, for example. So there's a risk that you could stop the business, but in testing your processes in an IR, there's not. And I agree with all the things you said, Kyle. Obviously, that's a lot of stuff for people to get their head around, and all the stuff they need to. But actually, fundamentally, I think, because you mentioned the platform, I think and maybe we're going to come on to other podcasts that talk about this, but actually, fundamentally, the way the market is moving is to build platforms that bring everything together, that you can deliver as a more of a holistic thing, single pane of glass, things that bring everything together. And back to your point about automation and threat intelligence, those are important fundamental factors. If you have the right level of intelligence coming, you can correlate that to make a more automated response, let's just say, because manual response is a very tricky thing to do too. You don't want to be running around trying to do something and being too late.
Everything I reeled off a few moments ago, right, is this sounds like a lot, but it's actually not. When you see it on paper in front of you, it's not a massive amount of things to do. And actually, a lot of it is not technology fueled, right? It is process fueled. It is using things you probably already have and getting them done properly, and spending some time to get your hygiene as a business done, right? Rather than just running whole head at 100 mile an hour and forgetting some of these things. Taking also, we all know that people are our most vulnerable asset in an organization, right? Because securing, protecting people, enabling people is quite a challenge. What have you seen organizations do that have been successful to get people in their organization aware of cybersecurity and the risks that it can pose to business?
There's a I guess it's a nuanced term coming out now called human risk management. And I always talk about human firewall, right? So most people within your organisation, you should actually see them as a human firewall. And I'll be honest, some businesses actually forget to focus on the people. They're too focused on chucking in technologies to create preventive controls. But actually, when you focus on training individuals and making individuals aware, cyber aware, then actually you start to see your risk reduced. I guess over the years, if I rewind the approach, some of it was more of an annual tick box type thing. Some customers think, well, in my ISO 27, it says I should do this at least once a year. So you'll see these things in your own organizations. You'll see this request to do your security training. You'll go and watch a video. It'll be a pretty noddy thing, but it will give you a level of awareness. So just to trigger in mind, but that's an annual thing. And for me, keeping yourself security aware is a continual thing. Not to a degree that it frustrates you from doing your job and what your day job is. So we're actually seeing some really smart stuff coming onto the market now, to enable that learning experience for more the psychological, where people learn in different ways. So customers are looking at that now, and looking at that human element, that security awareness, and taking a bit of a different approach to security awareness training, making it a bit more fun, rather than beating people over the head with a stick.
Yeah, I've seen that in many organisations, right, where the original training you used to get was monotone security, individual potentially, or a voiceover actor doing something which was like, I thought they're going, God, this is going to go on for ages, right? And then you get to see the newer ones that have been coming out, which are more like a TV show kind of skit that gives you a bit more kind of something to get invested in watching and maybe remember something from, because there's a bit of comedy value in there in some cases with a serious tone underneath, obviously. Well, I think one of the things you mentioned actually was around people doing the privacy training once a year and doing these certain things. Let's be realistic here. Why do people do that? It is for your cyber insurance, or for some level of insurance in your business a lot of the time, right? Now, if you want to look at enabling your people to understand the risks, again, as I mentioned earlier, start with the processes. They can understand their part and the risks they bring into the business based on the job they do. You can't do that in mass training. And that should be where you train your managers, your leadership teams, filter it down in a meaningful way that gets down to the individual at the coalface of working, doing the tasks that you need them to do. They understand what they do and how they do it and how it could impact the business if it went wrong. That's the best way of doing it and bringing it to life, in my opinion. Okay, so we've covered quite a lot in this episode, right? In ways and approaches and kind of the hypothetical way of going towards a strategy and then driving pipelines for roadmaps and things. We kind of touched on the approaches you can use to secure the hybrid platforms, some of the approaches you can look to secure the workforce, right? And that is everything from using SASE solutions, EDR, enablement technologies. Ultimately, anything you can do to remove the choice from end users, in some cases, is the best. But as we've touched on in the previous episode, where we talked about digital experience monitoring and things, the most secure platforms are also not the most user-intuitive platforms. So it is a trade-off that you have to make there to make it right for your business and for the users that do the job. So on that note, I've got one final question to ask both of you, which is the challenges that you've seen organizations face in implementing this hybrid environment. We talked about the challenges earlier, but maybe just one challenge and one way they've addressed it to overcome and deliver that security control or measure or approach. So, Stephen, to you first, if that's okay.
That one challenge is the actual change of the way the business operates. So it's not the business challenge has been the main challenge, and how they've overcome that. I'd like to say that they adjusted their processes, because they did in many cases, but it was with technology. They looked to technology to help them enable that change. So if you think about the massive need for hybrid working, because this is what this is about, it wasn't practical for some businesses just to enable VPN blanket across to everybody to be able to remote working. They needed different strategy, because VPN in one sense was no good in essence, to access maybe some SaaS applications that you start to use for your business and things like that. So they definitely needed a different approach. My view is that they did turn to technology rather than look at all the other stuff that's to help them enable that.
Yeah. So I think in that example is where an organization has implemented a SASE-based approach using secure access, a secure web gateway solution, basically filtering all traffic from to a single point location, right, allowing them to get levels of control, and then using CASB solutions, things like that, to then provide DLP overlays and SaaS access and all those kind of things, right? So basically, rather than changing the way the user works and the way they do things, they've changed the network flow of traffic to the segmentation thing that we talked about earlier, to then get that visibility and control that they need to meet compliance and regulation. So that's a really good one. Thank you. Rob?
I think mine links into the same thing, really, because fundamentally we can take all of the complexity that we just talked about across this episode, all the things that need to be done. But at the end of the day, if you can detect that someone is in your environment and you can see that lateral movement, you can see them early indicators, you can do something about it before it becomes a major incident for your business. And I think for me, there are 4 key areas that you need to do that. And most organizations that we speak to have probably only looked at 2 of them up until very recently. So the endpoint piece, but still that evolution from traditional AV to EDR, they can look at the behavior of activity on an endpoint for threat indicators rather than just signature based. So obviously that next gen protection piece. And the email piece, we still see on all the reports, all of our vendors, that business email compromise is still one of the biggest entry points for threats. So there's big focus in them 2 areas. But actually, if we look at then what the network should bring to that, as far as the visibility we should get from tapping the network, and also that protection of users when they're out on the open internet and on the web. So we're actually protecting all their web flows, which is what our SSE and SASE solutions have been talking about for the last 5 years. But it's amazing how many customers I speak to who are, yes, when my users in the office, they're behind their next gen firewall, everything's protected and secured. But when they go home, they're just on their broadband connection, and all they're relying on is that EDR solution. And that's a massive disparity in level of visibility and detection capability between 2 locations. And my biggest thing that I'd say is that consistency of operating model for a user, regardless of location. So let's start thinking about our offices the same as we think about McDonald's. Why is our office any more or less secure than McDonald's is or our home Wi-Fi is? If we get that consistent operation with all 4 protection layers, endpoint, network, web, and email, we should have great visibility to be able to actually protect our organization at a relatively simple level when we look at the platform play that we talked about earlier.
Just to add to that, Rob, if we apply that focus around the user and the identity of that user and apply all that focus around that, then you're going to go a long way from reducing your risk. So if you think about your perimeter and your network with next gen firewall now actually being the person, and you're putting it around their body, if you like, I would try and think of it that way rather than thinking, how do I secure this bit, this bit, this bit, this bit? Start with that user. I mean, there's a lot of other aspects to this, but that's what would be my advice for the starting point.
Yeah, and basically look at identity and risk-based profiling and things like that, right? And I think, again, just to throw a load of things out there, because that's what I like to do, because you 2 are a lot more technical and versed on this than I am. And we look at, for me, the simplicity of breaking this down against our framework and other things I mentioned before is users, data, apps, infra, endpoint. Right, so the 5 key areas. So Rob's got his 4 that he mentioned that include email and some of the more specifics. But if you take it a really high level up, if you're looking at how do I detect, respond, recover, and everything else, my user environment, my data, my apps, my infra, and endpoints, you've got most areas covered right at that point.
Yeah.
So we covered a lot. I'm just going to wrap this episode up. There's a view of how organizations can approach a minimum viable security architecture we mentioned earlier and the capabilities they can look to implement. We've covered the challenges of the hybrid cloud and securing that, and how we make sure that our users and our hybrid workforce are protected and able to do their jobs in the most secure manner. And I think we've also covered off really the advancements in technology to an extent that have allowed people to take away what they could maybe do next. Now, what's coming in a few weeks' time is some deep dive sessions and episodes where we're going to go into, well, SASE, what is that? What is it doing? Why would you need it? Why do you want to implement it versus doing traditional remote access solutions? What do you want to do around your data replication and recovery and protection responses, right? And things like that. So we're going to be getting into the depths of these things as we progress these episodes over the coming weeks and months. Take these first 3 episodes as a bit of a starting point of setting a scene to allow you to understand our direction of travel. Thanks for tuning into today's episode. Be sure to check out the back catalogue for more great insights. Don't forget to subscribe via your favourite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We appreciate your support. And if you have a topic you want us to cover, feel free to reach out. Catch you next time.